Every great world holds more than what sits on the surface, more than what the light touches first. The Pokemon world is no different, carrying beneath its cheerful exterior a depth that rewards those willing to look a little longer, drift a little slower, and let each quiet detail settle in its own time. This is a journey through what lies beneath, through the layers of history, mystery, and forgotten knowledge that the Pokemon series has accumulated across decades. And before we dig deep into this iceberg, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. What follows is not a rush toward the bottom of any list, but a calm and unhurried descent through things that are strange, surprising, and sometimes quietly beautiful. Beginning where most people already stand, in the shallower water, and moving gradually toward the places where things grow stranger and the light from above becomes something you only remember. There is a particular kind of knowledge that every Pokemon player carries without quite realizing it. Small facts absorbed over years of playing, small patterns noticed in the corner of an eye, things that feel familiar but have never quite been put into words. One of the oldest of these involves the legendary birds of the Kanto region, the trio of Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres that dominated early conversations about powerful Pokemon and appeared on the covers of magazines in the late 1990s. Their names feel natural now, as natural as any word that has been heard often enough to stop being examined. But the names carry something inside them, a pattern so precise it almost seems too deliberate. Each name contains a Spanish number hidden within its syllables. Uno, meaning one, rests inside the name Articuno. Dos, meaning two, is folded into the ending of Zapdos. And tres, meaning three, closes out the name Moltres. This was not a coincidence arrived at by accident. The design team placed these numbers intentionally, marking the birds in sequence the way one might number the pages of a document before binding it. The order also corresponds to their placement in the Pokedex, with Articuno appearing first, Zapdos second, and Moltres third. For players who grew up speaking Spanish, the pattern revealed itself immediately, carrying a kind of quiet satisfaction, the feeling of a secret that had been sitting in plain sight all along. The precision of this kind of design choice speaks to something important about how the Pokemon series has always worked beneath the surface. Decisions that seem decorative often carry more intention than they reveal at first glance. Names that feel invented often hold references, hidden languages, or numerical patterns that reward attention. The legendary birds were among the earliest examples of this layering, and for many players, they served as the first indication that looking more closely at Pokemon always yielded something worth finding. There is something about playground knowledge that exists differently from any other kind of knowledge passed from person to person without documentation knowledge. That feels more like a secret than a fact. One of the most enduring pieces of this kind of knowledge in the Pokemon community involves the act of throwing a Pokeball. The belief that something done with the controller during that moment, pressing a specific button, holding the joystick in a particular direction, mashing repeatedly and with great urgency, could influence whether the ball stayed closed or snapped open. Every player has a version of this belief. Some pressed B, some pressed A, some held the directional pad downward, some developed elaborate rituals involving sequences of buttons pressed in a specific order while mentally willing the catch to succeed. The thing worth noticing about this belief is not that it was wrong, though it was, but that it was so persistent and so widely shared. Players who had never spoken to one another arrived at remarkably similar conclusions, decided that some physical action on their part could tip the outcome in their favor, and then kept that belief even as they grew older and understood more about how probability actually worked. The B button had become something like a ritual object, and the act of pressing it had become something like prayer, something done in the hope of influencing an outcome that was already determined by numbers. The catch rate system in the games is genuinely complex, taking into account the species of the Pokemon, the remaining health of the creature, the type of ball being used, and whether any status conditions were present. No button input was ever part of that calculation, but the human instinct to participate in uncertain moments, to do something rather than simply wait, is older than any video game, and the button-mashing myth is really just one expression of it, dressed in the particular clothes of a Pokeball capture sequence. The world that the Pokemon series describes has always felt familiar and warm, a place where the concerns of ordinary life exist at a comfortable distance, but certain corners of the extended Pokemon universe push closer to the texture of a world that actually has weight and difficulty and consequence. There is a novelization of the Pokemon anime that describes the world in terms that feel noticeably different from the games and the television series. In this version of the Pokemon world, the town called Pallet is described not as a charming starting point, but as a community with very few opportunities. Most of its residents become Pokemon trainers, not out of passion or destiny, but simply because there is little else available to them. And most of those who set out as trainers fail, spending their formative years pursuing a path that does not lead anywhere stable, and eventually finding themselves without practical skills or employment prospects. The novelization introduces a kind of social realism into the Pokemon world that the games never quite reach. The trainer economy, when examined through this lens, becomes something more complicated than the familiar image of a young person setting out on a grand adventure. For every Ash this version of the world suggests, there are dozens of trainers who did not make it, who returned home without achievement and had to reckon with what that meant. The character of Ash's mother is described in ways that carry a quiet sadness. She is depicted as someone who stayed in Pallet, someone who once had different expectations for her life, and who carries the weight of choices made and paths not taken, alongside the pride she feels in her son. These details were never meant to be the primary focus of the Pokemon story, but they give the world a gravity that the official games generally avoid. There are things in the Pokemon series that exist not because anyone planned for them to exist, but because of the particular way software is written, the way systems interact with each other in combinations their creators never anticipated. One of the most famous of these is the Missingno encounter in the original Pokemon Red and Blue games. Missingno is not a Pokemon in any conventional sense. It is a fragment of incomplete data that the game's code attempted to interpret as a Pokemon when players accessed it through a specific sequence of actions involving the old man in Viridian City and a subsequent visit to the shores of Cinnabar Island. What appeared on screen was something that the game clearly was not designed to show, a blocky shape made of visual noise, a creature that seemed assembled from the leftover material of the game's own internal structure. The name Missingno is itself a kind of confession built into the code. It stands for missing number, the game's own label for a data slot that should have contained something defined and did not. When the game tried to display it, It reached for a shape that was technically a Pokemon form and returned something that looked like a visual error. What made the encounter feel like more than a simple glitch was the behavior it produced. Items in the sixth slot of the player's bag would multiply, sometimes dramatically, giving players hundreds of copies of whatever happened to be in that position. For players who discovered this in the era before internet guides were common, it felt like something genuinely mysterious had been found, something the game's creators had left behind or failed to notice. The community that grew up around Missingno, the documentation, the theories, the artwork, became one of the earliest examples of the Pokemon community finding meaning in a place where only a technical anomaly actually existed. The relationship between Pokemon and the company called Digimon has been treated as a competition for so long that the nature of what was actually being compared has sometimes become difficult to see clearly. Both properties emerged in Japan in the late 1990s, and both involved children forming bonds with creatures that could transform and grow. The similarity in those broad strokes was enough to fuel years of arguments among players and fans, arguments about which series had come first, which had borrowed from which was more original. The tone of these debates was often heated in a way that now seems disproportionate to the actual stakes involved. Digimon actually has roots in a different kind of toy than Pokemon. While Pokemon grew out of the Game Boy and the collecting instinct, Digimon began as a virtual pet device related to but distinct from the Tamagotchi devices that became popular. At nearly the same moment, the Digimon approach to transformation is also genuinely different from the Pokemon approach to evolution, involving branching paths and reversible changes that give the system a different kind of logic, less like a biological process and more like a set of decisions made over time. The things that each series does particularly well are not the same things. Approaching them as if one must be the true version and the other the imitation means missing what is interesting about both. The debates continue in quieter forms today, but the early intensity of the rivalry says something interesting about how strongly players identified with their chosen series, and how that identification required the other to be something lesser. There are creatures in the Pokemon world whose names reward attention in ways that are easy to overlook when the names are simply familiar. The name Alakazam contains within it the word that stage magicians have used for generations as an incantation, the syllable spoken at the moment of a trick's apparent impossibility. Kadabra, the stage before Alakazam, carries the word abracadabra inside it, cut short, as if the magic is not yet complete. And Abra, the youngest form, carries the beginning of that same word, a single syllable that holds the seed of what it will eventually become. The naming sequence maps directly onto the creature's development. Abra knows only a single move in the original games, teleporting away from battle before it can be damaged. It holds the beginning of a word and the beginning of a power, but has not yet grown into either. Kadabra develops more complexity, a longer name and a wider move pool, and Alakazam arrives at the full expression of both, a name that completes the magical incantation, and a Pokemon whose intelligence statistics in the original games were among the highest of any creature in the Pokedex. The Pokedex entries for Alakazam describe a creature with extraordinary memory and processing capacity, one that is said to have an IQ that dwarfs human capability and a brain that never stops working. These descriptions have a different texture from the entries for most Pokemon, leaning into something that feels less like a natural creature and more like an entity from a different category of existence, something that happened to take the shape of a Pokemon while becoming something else entirely. The Pokemon world contains certain numbers that appear in ways too consistent to be accidental, and one of them is the number 10. In the world of the games, the age at which a trainer is permitted to leave home and begin a journey is 10 years old. The official in-game explanation for this has shifted slightly across different games and different regions, but the age itself has remained stable. Children in the Pokemon world reach this threshold and cross it into something that resembles adulthood in its practical dimensions, setting out on journeys of potentially hundreds of miles, earning money, making independent decisions, entering contracts of a kind when they register for gym battles. The choice of 10 as this threshold connects to something in the actual history of the series. The original design of the protagonist in Red and Blue was intended to evoke a child old enough to be competent and self-sufficient, but young enough to make the adventure feel like an awakening rather than a professional undertaking. The age was chosen to place the player in a particular emotional relationship with the journey ahead. What makes the age interesting to consider is how much the Pokemon world actually asks of its 10-year-old trainers. They navigate caves without adult supervision. They confront organized criminal organizations. They manage complex team compositions and battle strategies that require genuine skill. The games handle this by simply not drawing attention to the gap between the protagonist's age and the demands placed on them, but certain corners of the extended Pokemon universe do draw attention to it, and what emerges is a portrait of a world with a very different understanding of when childhood ends. There is a particular kind of information that exists at the edges of what the Pokemon games officially say, information that lives in developer interviews and creator statements, and occasionally in documents that were never meant to be public. The relationship between the first Pokemon game and the landscape of Kanto is one of the things that exists partly in this territory. The towns and routes of the original games were modeled on a real region of Japan. The creator of the series, Satoshi Tajiri, grew up in a part of Japan that was gradually losing the open fields and ponds and streams where he had collected insects as a child. The landscape of his childhood was being replaced by development, and the world of Pokemon began as a way of preserving something of that experience, of creating a digital space where the act of finding creatures in the wild could continue. This origin makes the Pokemon world feel different when it is considered. What looked like a cheerful fictional landscape was also a memorial of sorts, a reconstruction in code and color of a real place that had changed. The rivers where wild Pokemon swim in the games correspond, in their spirit, if not their precise geography, to the rivers where a child once searched for insects. The high grass that hides wild encounters was once literal high grass, where real creatures waited. This context does not change the games themselves, but it adds a layer of feeling to them that sits beneath everything else. The Pokemon world was built from something personal, and that origin gives it a warmth that is easy to sense, but difficult to articulate without knowing where it came from. There are moments in Pokemon history that began as minor community events and grew into something that the broader internet remembers long after the original context has faded. The controversy around the quick ball and shiny Pokemon is one of these moments, small in its actual content, but revealing in what it showed about how passionately players care about the conventions of their hobby. A streamer caught a shiny Pokemon using a quick ball, which is a ball with a high catch rate when thrown at the beginning of an encounter. The catch was successful. Most people watching responded positively, but one comment suggested that using a quick ball on a shiny was somehow a failure of judgment, a missed opportunity to use a more aesthetically appropriate ball, one that matched the Pokemon's coloring or had some particular significance. The disagreement that followed was genuinely earnest on all sides, which is part of what made it memorable. The argument was not really about the quick ball. It was about what it means to find something rare and whether the method of acquisition changes the value of the thing acquired. Whether a shiny Pokemon caught in a quick ball is the same as a shiny Pokemon caught in a matching ball, or whether the story of how something was obtained is part of what makes it worth having. These are questions that Pokemon players have applied to many situations across the history of the community. The conversations about legitimacy and method and authenticity run beneath all of them, connecting arguments that seem to be about specific mechanics to deeper questions about what it means to earn something and whether all ways of achieving the same outcome are actually equivalent. The Pokemon games have always placed creatures in the world in ways that carry implicit ecological logic, distributing species across environments in a manner that suggests each one belongs somewhere specific. Caves hold rock and ground types that are suited to darkness. Oceans hold water types that exist in the blue space between cities. Forests and tall grass hold the creatures that are woven into the landscape, part of it rather than passing through it. This ecological consistency is part of what makes the Pokemon world feel coherent, a sense that each creature has a habitat and that the habitat has shaped the creature. But there are places in this ecology that reveal something interesting when examined closely. The Safari Zone, which appears in several games across different regions, exists as a designated space where rare Pokemon can be found under conditions different from normal. Gameplay. The mechanics of the Safari Zone have changed across games, but the concept of a preserve, a protected space where unusual creatures exist apart from the developed world, carries a meaning that connects to something real. The idea that certain wild spaces need protection, that without deliberate preservation, some kinds of creatures would simply no longer be findable, is not native to the Pokemon world. It is native to the actual world, and the Safari Zone is one of the places in the Pokemon series where the concerns of the real environment enter the fictional one with some directness. The Pokemon world has always implied a relationship between humans and wild creatures that is not without tension, and the Safari Zone is one of the places where that tension becomes visible. The Pokemon trading card game developed its own separate history alongside the video games, becoming something that existed in parallel and sometimes in conversation with the games, but followed its own logic and accumulated its own lore. The earliest sets of cards established certain creatures as particularly desirable, partly through rarity and partly through aesthetic qualities that made some cards feel more significant than others. The holographic Charizard from the base set became the most discussed of these, an object of desire whose value was partly material and partly symbolic, a card that meant something within the community beyond what it could actually do in a game. The history of how that card was counterfeited, how players developed expertise in detecting fakes, how the market around trading cards grew into something that attracted Attention from outside the original community is a piece of Pokemon history that sits at the intersection of hobby culture and economics. The same card that a child might have hoped to find in a pack at a corner store became, over time, an object that was sold at auction for sums that would have seemed incomprehensible in the context of its origin. What is interesting about the trajectory of the Charizard card is not just its value, but the nature of what generates that value. The card is a piece of printed cardboard. Its power in the game it was designed for is substantial, but not invulnerable. What it represents: a particular moment in the history of a community, a specific aesthetic quality that photographed well and looked unmistakably rare at the bottom of a foil. Pack is what the prices actually reflect. The market for the card is really a market for a feeling, and that feeling is not easily replicated. There are areas of the Pokemon world where the games gesture toward something darker without quite committing to it, places where the tone of cheerful adventure bends toward something else. Lavender Town in the original Pokemon Red and Blue games is the location most consistently associated with this shift in tone. The town sits in the northern part of Kanto, accessible after a significant portion of the main journey has been completed, and its defining feature is the Pokemon Tower, A, building constructed as a graveyard for Pokemon who have died. The building contains ghost-type Pokemon who appear as enemies, and at the top of the tower, the player encounters the ghost of a Marowak, killed by the criminal organization that operates in the game's background. The music of Lavender Town carries a quality that is different from the music of anywhere else in the game. It is quieter, slower, and built from intervals that create an unsettled feeling without quite resolving into anything overtly frightening. The music accomplished something that background music in a Game Boy game rarely managed, which is to change the emotional atmosphere of the space rather than simply providing sound to fill the silence. This led to the development of an extensive mythology around the Lavender Town music, claims about its specific frequencies, and their effects on listeners, stories about the original Japanese version of the music, and children who were harmed by it. None of these claims were true, but the fact that so many people found them credible speaks to how effectively the original music had established a particular kind of unease. The mythology grew around something real, a piece of music that genuinely felt like it belonged to a different kind of world, and then tried to explain that feeling through the language of conspiracy and hidden harm. The design of specific Pokemon has sometimes been the subject of controversy that extended beyond the community into public discourse, connecting to conversations about representation, stereotyping, and what it means for a popular franchise aimed at children to depict certain things. Jynx is one of the Pokemon most consistently discussed in this context. The original design of the creature, with its humanoid silhouette, exaggerated features, and a particular color scheme, drew comparisons to a style of representation with a specific and harmful history in American and global culture. The comparison was raised publicly in the early 2000s, and Nintendo and Game Freak responded by altering the character's appearance in subsequent games and media, changing the coloring of the creature's face. What is worth noting about the Jynx situation is both the response and the context. The design decision that produced the original Jynx was made in Japan in a creative context where the specific harmful associations carried by that design in American culture. may not have been the primary framework in which the creators were working. The Pokemon's design appears to draw from multiple Japanese cultural references, including the fashionably pale-faced imagery associated with certain style subcultures and theatrical traditions. The harm of the design in the specific American cultural context emerged from how it was received rather than how it was intended, which is a genuinely complicated space to navigate. The response to change the design was the right choice, and the willingness to make that change quickly once the concern was raised says something about how the franchise handled that moment. But the situation itself, the way a design can mean something entirely different in a different cultural context than the one where it was created, is something the Pokémon series has navigated in multiple ways across its history. The animated series that brought the Pokémon world to a much wider audience than the games had reached alone carried its own separate collection of surprising decisions and unconventional choices. One of the most discussed of these involves a banned episode from early in the run of the original anime. The episode, sometimes called Electric Soldier Porygon, featured a sequence of flashing imagery that was identified as potentially triggering for individuals with photosensitive epilepsy. The episode was never broadcast outside Japan and has never been officially released since the initial airing. Pikachu, rather than the actual Porygon character whose movements caused the sequence in question, received the blame in terms of how the situation affected subsequent media. Porygon and its evolutions never appeared in a prominent role in the anime again, despite being entirely uninvolved in the incident. The technical nature of the problem, a specific kind of visual strobing effect, led to permanent changes in how animation was produced not just for Pokémon, but for Japanese animated content more broadly. The guidelines developed in response to what happened that evening became industry standards that affected how fast images could alternate colors and how pronounced the contrast between them could be. The episode itself has become one of the most discussed pieces of unreleased Pokémon media, known by many players who have never seen it and likely never will, something that exists more as a shared understanding of an absence than as a piece of content anyone has actually experienced. There are games that appear adjacent to the main Pokémon series that illuminate the world from angles the core games do not reach. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series places the player inside the perspective of a Pokémon rather than a human trainer, and in doing so, it asks a different set of questions about the Pokémon world and what it contains. The series has developed an extended lore across multiple games, but the version of the world it describes is consistent in some notable ways. The Mystery Dungeon games present a world where Pokémon have their own societies, their own anxieties, their own sense of heroism and purpose that exists entirely apart from human interaction. The dungeons that give the series its name are unstable spaces where the architecture itself seems to resist being mapped, where floors rearrange themselves between visits and the layout of any particular path cannot be remembered from one journey to the next. This sense of instability, of a world that cannot be fully known or fixed in place, runs through the emotional texture of the games as well. The themes in the Mystery Dungeon games tend toward questions of memory, identity, and sacrifice in ways that the main series rarely pursues directly. Characters forget who they are, or discover that who they thought they were is not what they expected, or choose to give up something fundamental about themselves in order to protect what they love. These are not the concerns of a beginner trainer choosing a starter Pokemon. They are the concerns of someone much further into the experience of living, and the Mystery Dungeon games hold them without diminishing them. The Pokemon world has always maintained certain consistent rules about how evolution works, how experience accumulates, and how Pokemon grow from one form into another. But the logic of Pokemon evolution, when pressed, reveals that it is doing something quite different from biological evolution, and the distance between the word and the thing it describes is interesting to consider. In biology, evolution describes changes that occur across populations over many generations, driven by natural selection and genetic variation. A single organism does not evolve. Evolution is what happens to lineages over time. The Pokemon use of the word describes something that happens to an individual in a matter of seconds, a complete transformation of form and sometimes of behavior that is triggered by experience or specific conditions rather than by inheritance and reproduction. The Pokemon conception of evolution is closer to metamorphosis in the biological sense, the way a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly by internally reorganizing its own structure. Caterpie, becoming Metapod, and then Butterfree, follows this logic closely enough that the comparison feels appropriate. But for Pokemon like Magikarp, which spends its early existence as a nearly helpless fish and then transforms into the dragon like Gyarados, the jump between forms is so dramatic that it strains the caterpillar analogy considerably. The narrative logic of Pokemon evolution is really about potential and latency, about something hidden inside a creature that becomes visible under the right conditions. This is less a biological idea than it is an alchemical one, rooted in the ancient and persistent human belief that transformation is possible, that the form something wears is not the final word about what it is, and that the right circumstances can reveal something previously invisible. The production history of the Pokemon anime contains certain episodes that were completed and then withheld for reasons that ranged from the serious to the politically sensitive. An episode featuring the character James in a temporary role that involved a costume caused concern about how it might be received and was pulled before broadcast. An episode featuring a character with a large collection of guns was withheld after a real-world shooting incident made the content feel inappropriate. An episode featuring an image of a particular religious symbol was identified as potentially offensive to audiences in certain regions and was not broadcast in those areas. Each of these situations reflects a different kind of calculation about how content interacts with context. The same material can be appropriate in one set of circumstances and inappropriate in another, and the people responsible for making those judgments have sometimes made them in ways that seemed overly cautious and sometimes in ways that seemed clearly correct. The withheld episodes exist now as a category of Pokemon content that is officially acknowledged but not officially accessible, discussed extensively by fans who piece together information from various sources but who cannot simply watch what was made. The archive of banned and withheld Pokemon episodes is one of the places where the history of the franchise intersects with the broader history of how entertainment navigates. Cultural and political sensitivity, a set of decisions made under pressure that can be examined but not easily judged from the outside. There are features in the Pokemon games that were introduced, became beloved, and then disappeared in subsequent generations, leaving players to wonder whether the mechanics would return and why they had been removed. The feature known as Pokémon following the player, in which the first Pokémon in the party would appear on screen walking behind the player character, was introduced in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. The implementation was extraordinarily detailed, with hundreds of individual Pokémon each receiving their own following sprite, their own behavior patterns, and specific dialogue, triggered by interacting with them in particular locations. A water Pokémon following the player to the edge of the ocean might express something different than the same Pokémon following them through a mountain route. The small interactions accumulated into a sense of genuine companionship, a feeling that the creature was participating in the journey rather than simply waiting in storage. When subsequent games did not include the feature, the absence was noticed and discussed at length. The reintroduction of walking Pokémon in later titles was received with a specific kind of feeling, a recognition of something returned, something that had been missed in a way that went beyond convenience or mechanical utility. The feature touched something about how players related to their Pokémon, the sense of the creature as a companion rather than a tool, and its absence had made that dimension of the relationship feel less present. The history of the Pokémon world as described across games, anime, and supplementary materials contains certain events that are described only in their aftermath, events whose actual occurrence is felt rather than shown. The Pokémon War is one of these. The games never depict a war. They describe a world that has moved past a period of conflict, and certain details suggest that the world players explore is one still processing what that conflict left behind. Lieutenant Surge, the gym leader in Vermilion City, is described as a veteran whose Pokémon helped him survive combat. Mr. Fuji, who appears in Lavender Town, has a history of involvement with research that connects to Mewtwo and to events that carry the texture of institutional failure and moral compromise. The absence of fathers in the original Kanto region, the fact that many major characters have mothers who are present but fathers who are not, has been noted by players and discussed as potentially connected to this implied conflict, the suggestion that a generation of men did not return from whatever the Pokémon world experienced in its recent past. The games never confirm this reading. They do not deny it either. They simply present a world from which certain things are visibly absent and leave the reason for that absence in the space between what is said and what is shown. This quality of suggestion of a world that gestures toward its own history without fully narrating it is one of the things that has made the Pokémon world feel larger than any single game actually contains. There is always something beyond the edge of the visible map, something the story knows about but does not say. There are Pokémon whose Pokedex entries, when read carefully, describe things that would be genuinely alarming if they occurred in a world that otherwise operates by ordinary physical rules. Kadabra is described as spontaneously appearing in the bedrooms of people who have recently been struck by lightning. Haunter is described as possessing a tongue that can cause immediate death by touch, and a laugh that reduces the lifespan of anyone who hears it. Gengar is described as hiding in the shadows of populated rooms, waiting to steal the warmth from people who cannot see it. Hypno is described as an entity that has kidnapped children, lured away by its hypnotic pendulum in circumstances that match the structure of certain folk horror narratives. Precisely. The entries exist in tension with the games they appear in. In the games, these creatures are caught and trained and used in battles that are framed as sporting competitions. The Pokedex suggests that some of these creatures are genuinely dangerous to be near in ways that the gameplay never actualizes. The gap between the creature as described and the creature as experienced in the game is one of the consistent background textures of the Pokemon series, something that players learn to navigate by treating the Pokedex as a different kind of document than the game itself, a compendium of lore that does not quite match the lived experience of the world. Being described, the horror-adjacent entries cluster around the ghost and psychic types particularly, giving those categories a texture that other types do not carry in the same way. Rock types are primarily described in terms of their hardness and their geological properties. Ghost types are described in terms of the fear and danger they present to humans. The difference in framing is worth noticing. The Pokemon games have accumulated a remarkable collection of mythology around things that do not exist, things that players were told existed or came to believe existed, based on misunderstood game mechanics or deliberate rumors spread through playgrounds and early internet communities. The creature called Peekaboo was one of these. Before the second generation of Pokemon was released outside Japan, information about what it contained was fragmentary, and the community filled the gaps with speculation. A blue Pikachu-like creature appeared in promotional materials for the Pokemon movie in ways that were ambiguous enough to generate rumor. Players told each other there was a way to find it in the original games, that a specific sequence of actions would unlock something hidden that the normal progression of the game did not reveal. The creature people were actually imagining was Meryl, a water-type Pokemon who did eventually appear in the second generation, but the mythology around Peekaboo preceded and outlasted the actual reveal. The Mew under the truck rumor occupies a different category, rooted in an actual truck that appears in the Pokemon games near the SS Anne. The truck serves no narrative purpose. It simply sits there, and its existence seemed to invite explanation. The rumor that Mew could be found beneath it, accessible through a specific sequence of actions involving strength after the ship had departed, was specific enough to feel credible. Many players tried. The truck cannot be moved, and Mew was not beneath it, but the specificity of the rumor kept it alive long after it should have been disproven. There is a Pokemon whose design history involves a conflict that extended outside the normal channels of intellectual property disputes and into something more personal and more complicated. The designer Uri Geller, known for claiming to bend spoons through psychokinetic ability, pursued legal action against Nintendo of America after becoming aware of the Pokemon Kadabra. Geller argued that the creature's name, its appearance, and the spoon it carried constituted an unlicensed use of his likeness and persona. The Japanese name for Kadabra, which translates approximately to a famous practitioner's name in the specific tradition of theatrical mentalism, made the connection more difficult to dismiss. The legal dispute contributed to a period during which Kadabra was largely absent from the trading card game, appearing in only a limited number of sets during an extended period. The situation was eventually resolved after years of absence, with new Kadabra cards being produced following what appeared to be a reconciliation between Geller and Nintendo. The Kadabra situation is one of the more unusual intersections between the Pokemon franchise and the outside world, a moment where a design decision made in the context of naming and visual inspiration collided with the specific sensitivities of a real person who recognized something of themselves in a fictional creature and did not find the recognition flattering. The development of the Pokemon games across generations has involved decisions about what to include and what to remove that have not always been fully explained and have sometimes been the source of significant frustration within the community. The removal of the National Pokedex in Pokemon Sword and Shield, the decision not to make all previously available Pokemon accessible within the game, was announced under the term Dexit within the community and generated a level of discussion that extended well beyond typical gaming discourse. The reasoning offered at the time involved the increased quality of animations and models required by the move to home console hardware, the suggestion that creating high fidelity versions of every existing Pokemon would not have been feasible within the development timeline. The community response was complex and sometimes heated. Players who had maintained continuous teams of preferred Pokemon across multiple games found themselves unable to transfer certain creatures. Players who had expected that the move to more powerful hardware would expand rather than restrict what was available found the opposite. The discussion that followed touched on expectations about backward compatibility, about what promises a long-running franchise makes implicitly to its audience, and about how a series balances the needs of longtime players against the reality of what any development team can practically accomplish in a given span of time. The frustration was real, and the attachment that generated it was also real. The way players relate to specific Pokemon across many years of play creates something that resembles ownership even where no actual property rights exist, and the removal of access to creatures that players had carried for years touched that attachment directly. The Pokemon world has always been home to organizations that operate in opposition to the ideals represented by the main characters, and the structure of these organizations has shifted considerably across the series in ways that reflect different ideas about what makes an antagonist meaningful. Team Rocket in the original games is primarily a criminal organization driven by profit and willing to use Pokemon as tools for theft and extortion. The goal is material gain, and the Pokemon are instrumentalized in service of that goal. Giovanni, the organization's leader, is a gym leader who has hidden his criminal enterprise beneath the legitimate structure of a training community. The organizations that followed in later games tend toward more ideological motivations. Teams that believe Pokemon and humans should not coexist. Teams that believe the existing world should be destroyed and remade according to a specific vision. Teams that seek to awaken ancient forces in service of a philosophical position about the nature of reality. The escalation from profit-motivated crime to world-threatening ideology reflects something about how the games understood what they were trying to say, and how the stakes of each new adventure needed to feel appropriately significant within the logic of the story being told. The most effective of the villainous organizations tend to be the ones where the antagonist's worldview is internally consistent, where their goals make sense from within their own framework even when they are clearly harmful from the outside. The best of these antagonists reveal something about the world they inhabit, the way in Black and White uses the question of Pokemon liberation to illuminate the actual relationships between humans and creatures in ways that the games usually leave beneath the surface. There is a character who appears in the Pokemon games whose presence raises questions that the games themselves never quite address, questions about continuity and memory and what it means for the same person to appear in multiple different stories set in different times. Professor Oak is the most consistent of these recurring presences, the figure who begins the player's journey by explaining the world and offering a choice of starter Pokémon. He appears across multiple games in ways that establish his role without significantly deepening it. A mentor figure who recedes once his initial function has been fulfilled. But Oak also appears in the anime as a character with a life and relationships and a history that the games never show. He and Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, are described as having known each other. The specifics of that relationship, what it was and why it ended, and what it meant for the world that followed, exist at the edge of what any version of the story actually says. The suggestion that the Pokemon world's primary figure of benevolent mentorship and its primary figure of criminal organization have a shared history is one of the details that, when noticed, changes the texture of everything around it. The consistency of Oak across different iterations of the Pokemon world, the way he appears in game after game occupying the same role, makes him feel like a fixed point in a world that otherwise changes constantly. Fixed points in a world that changes are interesting places because they accumulate history differently than moving things do. The Pokemon games have always included items whose full behavior was not documented in any official material, things that players discovered through experimentation or were told about by others and incorporated into their understanding of the game before any official confirmation existed. The Master Ball, which guarantees capture of any Pokemon it is thrown at without fail, exists at one end of this spectrum, a known quantity with fully documented properties. At the other end are items and mechanics whose behavior was understood imprecisely for years before anyone examined the underlying code. The behavior of the shiny charm, which increases the odds of encountering Pokemon with alternate colorations, was understood in broad terms long before the specific mathematical. Parameters were confirmed by data extraction. Players knew it worked, could observe that it seemed to work, built strategies around it, but the precise rate of improvement was a subject of community calculation rather than official documentation for an extended period. This situation, where the community develops and tests and refines its understanding of game mechanics that the developers have never fully explained, is one of the distinctive features of how the Pokemon community functions. The games contain more than the documentation describes, and the process of uncovering and confirming what the games actually contain, rather than what players have been told. They contain is an ongoing project that has continued for as long as the games have existed. The creatures of the Pokemon world have names that function differently in different languages, and the process of adapting those names has sometimes produced results that carry their own layers of meaning. The creature known as Arcanine in English carries a name that combines arcane, suggesting mystery and ancient power, with the suffix typical of canine, marking it as a dog. Creature. The Japanese name from which this is adapted references a legendary creature from Chinese and Japanese mythology, a divine beast of considerable significance whose image appears in temple architecture and traditional art across East Asia. The English localization preserves some of the power of the original by emphasizing the mystery and grandeur implied by the source material, but it necessarily loses the specific cultural resonances that the Japanese name carries for a player familiar with the mythological tradition being referenced. This is a representative case of a challenge that every localization team navigates: how to carry meaning across languages when the meaning is partly built from cultural knowledge that is not shared equally by all audiences. The Pokedex entry for Arcanine in certain games describes it as a legendary Pokémon, a classification that sits oddly alongside its availability as a regular catch in most games. Where it appears. The entry creates the impression of a creature whose legendary status has been absorbed into the ordinary world, a being that should occupy a different category, but instead appears in tall grass, catchable with a Pokeball, available to anyone willing to look. The Pokemon world has produced a specific kind of media in its extended history that sits at the boundary between official content and player experience, games and spin-offs that approach the established universe from angles that reveal things the main series does not address. Pokemon Snap, in which the player travels through environments photographing wild Pokemon and their natural behavior, presented the Pokemon world from a perspective that the main games never quite captured. In the main games, wild Pokemon exist primarily as opponents to be defeated or captured, resources to be acquired or overcome. In Snap, they exist as subjects, things to be observed in their environment, going about activities that have nothing to do with the player's presence. The behavior of Pokemon in Snap, the way they interact with each other and with their surroundings, suggested a world that continued to exist when no trainer was present. A world that did not simply pause between player encounters. The images that could be captured in that game, a Gyarados launching itself from the water, a Charizard resting on a stone platform above a volcanic landscape, exist as a kind of documentation of a world that the main games imply but do not show. The sequel to Pokemon Snap, released decades later on different hardware, extended this concept significantly, creating a more elaborate version of the world as living system, and allowing players to interact with the environment in ways that affected the creature's behavior. The long gap between the original and its sequel did nothing to diminish how much players had wanted exactly what both games provided, a way of experiencing the Pokemon world as something other than a series of obstacles to overcome. The history of competitive Pokemon is the history of a community developing a vocabulary and a set of skills that the games themselves never quite anticipated, and that exist almost entirely apart from the experience of playing through the main story. The terms that competitive players use to discuss their practice, the categories of creature that they prioritize, and the strategies they employ emerged through community, documentation, and refinement rather than through any official guidance from the game's creators. Smogon, the most prominent community organization for competitive Pokemon, has developed and maintained tier systems and rule sets that have become the de facto standard for organized play outside of the official championship system. The tier system that Smogon developed places Pokemon into categories based on their viability in competitive play, with the highest tier containing the most powerful and most commonly used creatures in the lower tiers, providing frameworks for play that excludes particularly overwhelming combinations. The tiers shift as new games are released and as the community develops new strategies, a living taxonomy of competitive balance that requires continuous maintenance. What is interesting about the competitive community's relationship to the games is the degree to which it treats the game differently than the designers intended. Moves and abilities that exist primarily as interesting options in the story mode become precisely calibrated tools in competitive play. Creatures whose designs are charming, but whose statistics are modest, become rarities in the highest levels of play. The same game contains two quite different experiences, separated by the context in which it is approached. The legendary Pokemon of the Hoenn region introduced something to the series that had not quite existed before, a pair of creatures whose conflict was presented as something literally world-shaping, capable of ending the world through the dominance of either. Kyogre and Groudon, the cover legendaries of Pokemon Sapphire and Ruby respectively, represent competing elemental forces at a scale that the series had not previously engaged with so directly. Kyogre expands the ocean. Groudon expands the land. In the mythology of the Hoenn region, their ancient conflict reshaped the world, and the storyline of the games involves an organization attempting to awaken one of them without fully understanding that waking either would trigger a response from the other. The resolution of this conflict in the game's story does not depend on defeating the legendary Pokemon, but on awakening a third Rayquaza who descends from the upper atmosphere to separate the two and return the balance. This structure, in which two opposing extremes are moderated by a third that exists above both of them, is a mythological pattern that appears across many cultures and many stories, and finding it embedded in a Pokemon game gives the story a depth that the surface narrative does not always signal. The primal forms introduced in subsequent remakes added a new layer to this mythology, the suggestion that Kyogre and Groudon and the forms that appear in the original games were already diminished versions of what they had once been, and that their true power was something the world had not encountered in ages. The primal forms look different from the standard forms in ways that emphasize their connection to something older and wilder, something that predates the current era of the world. The Pokemon games have always contained time as a variable in ways that go beyond the simple passage of days and seasons. Gold and Silver introduced a real-time clock into the games for the first time, tying the behavior of the game to the actual time of day and the player's location. Certain Pokemon appeared only at night, certain events triggered only in the morning. The world of the game became synchronized with the world outside it, not perfectly, but enough to create a sense of the game as something that existed continuously, changing even when the player was not present. This connection between game time and real time has deepened across subsequent generations. Day and night cycles affect which wild Pokemon are available and where certain NPCs are located. Seasonal changes in the games that implemented them altered the appearance of environments and the availability of certain content. The games that included these systems felt more like a world that existed continuously than games that simply paused at the moment a player stopped engaging with them. The Pokemon series has also played with time as a narrative element in ways that carry more philosophical weight. The storyline of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl involves a legendary creature who is described as the god of time, capable of changing the flow of temporal experience itself. The mythology built around this creature and its counterpart in Pokemon Pearl gestures toward questions about the relationship between time and space, between the measurable passage of moments and the physical structure of the world they pass through, questions that the games do not fully resolve, but that they raise with a seriousness that is easy to underestimate. The Pokemon world contains structures and locations whose purpose or history is implied, but never fully stated, places that feel like they carry a significance that the games do not quite explain. The ruins that appear in various Pokemon games, from the ruins of Alph and Johto to the Sky Pillar and Hoenn to the various ancient structures scattered through later regions, suggest a world with a deep history that the current age is only partially uncovered. The puzzles within these ruins, the Unown alphabet that lines the walls of certain chambers, the tablets and inscriptions that describe events from before the current era, all point toward a history of the Pokemon world that is more complex than any single game makes explicit. The Unown are themselves one of the more intriguing presences in the series, a type of Pokemon whose forms correspond to the letters of an alphabet that has appeared across multiple games and in the Pokemon film The Power of One. Their relationship to language and to the history of the world is never fully explained. They appear in ruins, they respond to certain stimuli, they are described as connected to the dimensions of the unconscious mind in some entries, but the full story of what they are and where they came from is one of the things the series holds open rather than resolving. The opacity of the Unown's purpose is part of what makes them compelling. They feel like a genuine mystery, a category of creature whose significance within the world is real, even if the nature of that significance is not made explicit. In a series that generally explains its own lore with some thoroughness, creatures that remain unexplained carry a particular weight. There are certain facts about the process of making the original Pokemon games that illuminate how unlikely it was that the series existed at all, how many obstacles the project encountered before it reached players and became the phenomenon it became. The development of Pokemon Red and Green, the original Japanese versions of the game, took 6 years. The team that made them was small, working with limited resources, on a game whose core concept was original enough to generate skepticism within the company about whether it would find an audience. Satoshi Tajiri's vision of a game centered on collecting, trading, and battling was not a category that existed in a form that anyone could point to as proven. The games were nearly finished multiple times, and then continued past what had seemed like their completion, adding features and refining systems in ways that extended the development timeline considerably. The Game Boy itself was approaching the end of what Nintendo considered its commercial viability at the moment the Pokémon games were released, which meant that the games arrived at a moment when the platform they required was expected to be declining rather than growing. What happened instead was that the games introduced a new audience to the Game Boy and extended its commercial life in ways that no one had predicted. The linkage mechanic, which required a physical cable connecting two Game Boys for trading and battling, generated social dynamics around the device that were different from anything the platform had previously produced. Players brought their Game Boys to school not just to play, but to trade, creating a kind of social currency around the creatures they had and the creatures they needed. There is a particular category of Pokemon lore that exists in the interstitial spaces between official games, in spin-offs and supplementary materials and statements made in, passing by developers who did not intend to start extensive community discussions. The relationship between Cubone and its mother is one of these pieces of lore. The Pokedex entries for Cubone describe a creature who wears the skull of its deceased mother as a helmet and cries at night for the parent it has lost. This is an unusually specific and emotionally weighted piece of backstory for a creature that players might first encounter in the rock tunnel of Kanto, and it generates questions. The presence of a Marowak ghost at the top of the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town connects directly to this backstory. The ghost who appears in the game, who must be encountered and ultimately freed as part of the storyline, is explicitly described as the mother of a Cubone. The Marowak was killed by Team Rocket, and her ghost remained in the tower because she was concerned for her child. This small piece of narrative, embedded in what might otherwise have been a simple dungeon puzzle, is one of the moments in the original Pokemon games where the world revealed itself to be capable of genuine emotional weight. It did not ask the player to care about it. It simply presented the situation and trusted that the situation was moving enough to carry itself. Players who noticed it and understood it found that the game had done something unexpected, that it had told a small and complete story about loss and love in a medium that was not generally expected to do such things. The Pokemon series has engaged repeatedly with the question of what intelligence means in the context of the creatures it describes, and some of its answers to that question are more unsettling than they first appear. Metagross is described as having a brain formed from the fusion of 4 linked nervous systems, creating a computational capacity that exceeds that of a supercomputer. Alakazam is described as having an IQ that grows continuously and a memory that is perfect and total. Gardevoir is described as capable of predicting the future and generating a small black hole to protect the trainer it is bonded with. These descriptions place certain Pokemon in categories that are difficult to reconcile with the framing of the game, which is that they are creatures kept in small, spherical containers and brought out when their trainers need them for competition. The gap between the described capabilities of some Pokemon and the circumstances they inhabit is one of the persistent, strange textures of the series, a gap that the games generally prefer not to examine too directly. The Pokemon that are described as having human-like or superhuman intelligence are particularly interesting in this context because their participation in the trainer system implies a voluntary element that is not present in creatures who are simply following instinct. A creature with superhuman intelligence who participates in Pokemon battles is making a choice to do so in a way that a creature operating on instinct is not. The implications of that distinction are not things the games address, but they linger in the background of any encounter with a creature described as dramatically more intelligent than the humans who direct it. There are aspects of the Pokemon world that become strange when examined through the framework of ordinary ecology, things that the games present as normal features of their world that would, in an actual ecosystem, raise significant questions. The experience point system, through which Pokemon gain in strength and capability after defeating other creatures in battle, implies something about the energetics of the Pokemon world that does not quite fit ordinary biological frameworks. In biology, energy flows from food, and strength is built through rest and nutrition. In the Pokemon world, the act of defeating opponents appears to be directly nutritive in some sense, converting combat into capability in a way that has no obvious physical mechanism. The healing centers that appear in every town and city, providing complete restoration of health and energy at no cost to the player, imply a medical infrastructure that would be extraordinary even by the standards of advanced human medicine. The healing is immediate and complete. No explanation for how it works is ever offered. The Chansey and Blissey who assist at these centers are described as having healing properties, but the specific mechanism by which a completely depleted party is restored to full health in moments is simply one of the things the world does not explain. These gaps between the world's described properties and the physical logic that would be required to produce them are part of the texture of playing in a world that is built from imagination rather than simulation. The games make these accommodations for the player experience rather than for physical plausibility, and that is entirely appropriate for what they are. But noticing the gaps is part of how the world reveals its own construction. The animated Pokémon series engaged with the question of what Mewtwo was and what its existence meant in ways that the games handled differently, and the treatment in the first. Pokémon film remains one of the most discussed pieces of the extended Pokémon universe. Mewtwo Strikes Back presented a creature that was aware of its own origin, aware that it had been created rather than born, and that had developed a response to that knowledge. That began with rage and moved towards something more complicated. The film's central question is whether a creature defined by what it was made from can escape that definition, whether origin is destiny or simply a starting point. The resolution of the film has been discussed extensively for the way it handled its own premise. Mewtwo's conclusion that the circumstances of one's creation do not determine the value of one's life is a genuinely philosophical position arrived at through a genuinely difficult process within the narrative, and the film presents it with a seriousness that was unusual for the context in which it appeared. The different versions of the film that were released in different regions sometimes told the story differently, with the English localization altering or removing certain dialogue that was present in the original Japanese version. These differences affected how Mewtwo's journey was framed and what the film's conclusion was understood to mean, making different audiences' experience of the same story actually quite different at the level of theme and implication. The Pokémon world has always contained things that are presented as fictional within its own mythology, legends and stories that characters in the world describe as legend, whose literal truth is then confirmed or complicated by the events of the games. The legendary Pokémon of the Alola region exist within a Hawaiian-influenced mythological tradition that the games represent with considerable care. The Tapis, the guardian deities of the four islands, are described in terms that draw from the actual traditions of indigenous Hawaiian culture, adapted into the framework of the Pokémon world. The games engage with these traditions through the lens of appreciation, through the character of Tapu Koko and its companions and the role they play in the Alola regions. Ecology and culture. The treatment of real cultural traditions within the Pokémon world is an area where the series has been more or less successful at different moments. When the adaptation is done with attention and care, taking the spirit of a tradition and using it to build something new, the result enriches the Pokémon world by connecting it to the depth of human cultural history. When it is done less carefully, the result can feel like borrowing that does not fully honor what it is using. The Alola region's engagement with Hawaiian culture is generally considered among the more thoughtful examples of this kind of adaptation within the series, creating a region with a distinctive and consistent cultural texture that extends from the legendary Pokémon through the visual design of the environments and into the way human characters describe their relationship to the land and the creatures they share it with. The community that has grown around the Pokémon franchise has developed its own traditions and practices that exist apart from anything the games themselves contain, practices that are recognized by experienced players in the way that any specialized community recognizes its own conventions. The practice of Nuzlocke challenges involves playing a Pokémon game under a specific set of self-imposed rules. In its basic form, a Nuzlocke requires that if a Pokémon faints in battle, it is considered dead and must be permanently retired, and that only the first Pokemon encountered on. Each new route may be captured. These rules transform a game that is normally quite forgiving, where defeat is merely a setback and every creature can be healed to full health, into something with genuine stakes, where loss is permanent and decisions carry real consequences. The Nuzlocke challenge originated from a webcomic drawn by a player who set these rules for himself and then documented the experience in comic form. The format spread through the community and generated an enormous body of similar documentation, written and visual accounts of players attempting the challenge with varying degrees of success. The format spread further into other games beyond Pokemon, and additional variants were developed that added new restrictions or modified the existing ones. What the Nuzlocke challenge reveals is something about the community's desire for the games to mean more than they do by default, to have the stakes of the adventure match the emotional investment that players bring to it. The games themselves are designed to be completable by most players who engage with them seriously. The Nuzlocke challenge removes that safety net, and in doing so changes the experience into something that can generate genuine attachment and genuine grief when creatures are lost. There are Pokemon whose designs contain historical or scientific references that are not immediately visible, but that become interesting once noticed. Relicanth is designed after the coelacanth, a species of fish long believed to be extinct that was discovered alive in deep ocean waters in the 1930s. The coelacanth had a fossil record suggesting it had existed for hundreds of millions of years with very little change, and its discovery alive was one of the more remarkable. Events in 20th century biology, a creature from deep time suddenly present in the contemporary world. Relicanth's Pokedex entries describe it as a Pokemon that has existed unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, a living fossil found in the deepest parts of the ocean. Adapting the real coelacanth story into the Pokemon world with some fidelity to the source. Aerodactyl draws from the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic era, but its design incorporates elements that distinguish it from a literal pterosaur reconstruction, emphasizing the teeth, the wing membrane, and a ferocity that the fossil record only partially supports. The Pokemon world's relationship to paleontology across the fossil Pokemon that appear in various games is an interesting thread to follow, showing how the games have adapted real prehistoric creatures into the specific visual and mechanical vocabulary of the series. The fossil revival mechanic itself carries a small piece of scientific history within it. The idea of recovering genetic information from ancient preserved material and using it to recreate extinct organisms was a subject of genuine scientific discussion in the early 1990s, around the time the Pokemon games were being developed. The fossil Pokemon were not designed in a vacuum. The ending that the original series writer Takeshi Shudo envisioned for the Pokemon anime has become one of the more discussed pieces of the franchise's extended mythology, partly because of how different it is from what the actual series provided, and partly because of what it suggests about the story's possible meaning. Shudo's planned ending described a Pokemon rebellion, a moment at which the creatures who had coexisted with humans would recognize the nature of their situation and respond to it. Pikachu was imagined as the leader of this uprising, the most famous face of the partnership between humans and Pokemon becoming the symbol of its end. Team Rocket's Meowth, able to communicate between the two species, would attempt to mediate and failed to do so effectively. The rebellion, as Shudo imagined, it was not simply a conflict, but a revelation, a moment at which the fundamental relationship between humans and Pokemon would be exposed as something more complicated than the partnership the series had depicted. The implication was that what had looked like friendship might have been something else, that the cheerful world of badges and tournaments had been built on a foundation that, once examined directly, could not sustain itself. Shudo died before the series reached any ending, and the actual animated series eventually concluded Ash's journey in a way that honored the friendship at the core of the story, without reaching the darker territory he had imagined. But the existence of his planned ending gives the series a shadow, a version of itself that could have existed, and that, once known, makes certain aspects of the actual series feel different to consider. The question of who created Arceus, the Pokemon described as the creator of the Pokemon world, is one that the games raise without resolving and that has generated significant discussion within the community. Arceus is described as the being that existed before the universe, that shaped the world from chaos, that created the legendaries who govern time and space and antimatter. The mythology of Arceus is built from creation narrative conventions that appear across many religious traditions. The idea of a supreme being who precedes everything and is the source of everything that follows. In the context of the Pokemon world, this mythology is presented with a seriousness that the games usually reserve for their most significant moments. But the question of what preceded Arceus, what the state of the universe was before Arceus existed and created itself, is a question that the games gesture toward without answering. The entries describe Arceus as hatching from an egg, which implies a moment before the egg existed, which implies something that the creation mythology does not quite account for. This is not a unique challenge for creation mythology, which generally cannot avoid the question of what preceded the creator, but it is interesting to find it present in this particular context. The Pokemon universe's mythology extends beyond Arceus into structures that imply multiple dimensions, multiple versions of the world, and the possibility of travel between them. The games that have explored these concepts most directly, including the Delta episode in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and the stories involving the Ultra Beasts in Sun and Moon, suggest a cosmology considerably more complex than any single game storyline makes explicit. The creatures called Ultra Beasts, introduced in Pokemon Sun and Moon, represent a genuinely distinctive moment in the series, a set of Pokemon whose visual design and narrative framing deliberately set them apart from everything that came before. The Ultra Beasts are described as originating from a different dimension, accessed through the wormholes that appear in the sky above the Alola region. Their designs follow rules that feel different from the rules that govern other Pokemon, more elongated, more geometric in unexpected places, more insistently wrong in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely, but that are immediately noticeable. The effect is of creatures that were designed by someone who understood what Pokemon look like and then made deliberate choices not to follow those conventions. The reception of the Ultra Beasts within the community was divided along lines that tracked fairly closely with how different players relate to the series. Players who valued the ecological and naturalistic aspects of the Pokemon world found them difficult to accept as Pokemon in any meaningful sense. Players who appreciated the series for its willingness to include genuinely strange designs found them to be among the more interesting additions in recent memory. The Ultra Beasts made explicit something that had always been implicit in the Pokemon world's relationship to strangeness, that the category of Pokemon is wide enough to include things that feel deeply alien rather than familiar, things that do not draw on the same visual vocabularies as most of the series, but that occupy the same mechanical role. The question of where the category ends is one the Ultra Beasts push against in ways that creatures like Garchomp or Hydreigon, however strange their designs, do not. The Pokemon games have been played on hardware that they were not designed for, modified in ways that their creators did not intend, and used as platforms for creative projects that range from personal expression to extended artistic statements. ROM hacking, the practice of modifying the code of Pokemon games to create new versions with different stories, different Pokemon, different regions, or different mechanics, has produced a body of work that exists entirely outside the official franchise, but that has generated its own community and its own history. Some ROM hacks are primarily technical demonstrations showing what can be done with the underlying systems. Others are extended narrative projects, telling stories that use the mechanical vocabulary of Pokemon games to address themes and experiences that the official games do not. The ROM hack Pokemon Uranium was a decade-long development project released by a small team, featuring an entirely new region, a new set of original Pokemon, and a storyline that engaged with themes of nuclear power and environmental consequence. The project was eventually taken down following legal pressure from Nintendo, but it had already been downloaded by a large number of players and exists in the community's memory. As an example of what dedicated developers could accomplish working with the tools the original games provided. The Minecraft mod called Pixelmon, which integrated Pokemon into the Minecraft environment, similarly generated a large player base and similarly attracted legal attention. A recurrent pattern in which projects built from the creative possibilities of the Pokemon franchise outgrow their unofficial status and encounter the limits of intellectual property law. The Pokemon world has generated a body of fan-created content that, in aggregate, represents one of the largest creative outputs associated with any single franchise in entertainment history. The volume of fan art, fan fiction, fan games, fan animations, and fan music that exists around Pokemon is difficult to fully survey, touching every genre and medium and style that human creativity has produced in the context of visual and narrative art. Some of this creative output is extremely accomplished, produced by artists who have developed real skill and who use Pokemon as a vehicle for artistic expression that they might otherwise direct at original work. The relationship between this fan creativity and the official franchise is complicated in ways that the franchise has managed with varying degrees of grace at different moments. Nintendo and the Pokemon Company have generally pursued intellectual property enforcement when fan projects became commercially successful or particularly visible, while generally tolerating the vast majority of non-commercial fan work. The community of creators around Pokemon has developed its own conventions and its own sub-communities, with fan fiction writers, competitive players, card collectors, and sprite artists each maintaining their own spaces within the broader phenomenon. These communities have existed for decades and have changed across the era of the internet, moving from early forums to later social platforms, developing new traditions and losing older ones, but maintaining a continuous presence that reflects how deeply the franchise has embedded itself in the creative life of the people who grew up with it. There is a particular aesthetic that the Pokemon games of the 5th generation, Pokemon Black and White, pursued more deliberately than any previous generation, an aesthetic built around the question of what it means for a creature to exist within the specific context of the Pokemon world. The legendary storyline of Black and White centers on a character named N, who has lived with Pokemon his entire life and has developed a belief that Pokemon battling is a form of exploitation, that the relationships between trainers and their Pokemon cannot be genuine because they are structured around power and control. N does not simply believe this abstractly. He believes it because of his specific experience, because of how he was raised and what he was taught, and what it meant for the understanding he developed of the world. The game does not straightforwardly agree or disagree with N's position. It presents a protagonist who has genuine positive relationships with their Pokemon who choose to remain with their trainers and who demonstrate clear affection for them, alongside an antagonist whose critique of the system is not presented as simply wrong. The result is one of the more genuinely complicated villain narratives in the series, one that ends not with N's defeat and humiliation, but with his recognition that his understanding was incomplete, and with the suggestion that the world he had dismissed might contain real things that he had not previously allowed himself to see. The design of Reshiram and Zekrom, the legendaries at the center of Black and White's story, embodies this thematic complexity. They are associated not with a simple opposition of good and evil, but with the opposition of truth and ideals, a distinction that carries different weight depending on how the terms are understood, and that the game never quite resolves in favor of either. There are things in the Pokemon games that were added for technical reasons, to fill space, to test functionality, or to serve as placeholders, that then became meaningful within the world players built around them. The Pokemon called Ditto, which can transform into any other Pokemon, and which has the same base statistical spread across every attribute, exists as a creature that was likely created partly as a convenient tool for the game's mechanics around breeding. Ditto can breed with virtually any Pokemon to produce eggs, making it a universal partner in the breeding process. But the creature's existence within the game world has generated extensive speculation about what it actually is, and whether its ability to transform into anything implies a relationship to other creatures that the game does not make explicit. The theory that Ditto is a failed clone of Mew, derived from the same genetic material used to create Mewtwo, but produced imperfectly, has circulated for long enough to have become one of the most discussed pieces of Pokemon fan theory. The evidence cited includes the similar moveset available to both creatures, the similar statistical construction, and the presence of Ditto in areas associated with Mewtwo's creation in the original games. The theory has never been confirmed or explicitly denied by any official source. Whether or not the theory is correct, what it demonstrates is how the community engages with the space between what the games say and what they leave open. Ditto's existence creates a question, and the community has filled that question with an answer that connects it to one of the most narratively significant Pokemon in the series. That connection, whether intentional or not, makes both creatures more interesting. There is a specific tradition within the Pokemon community of taking the games to their mechanical extremes, of finding the minimum possible path through a game or applying constraints that reveal properties of the game's systems that normal play would never encounter. The minimum badge challenge, in which players attempt to complete the original Pokemon games while collecting as few gym badges as possible, reveals how little of the game's structure is actually necessary to reach its conclusion, The badges in the original games serve primarily as gates, requiring the player to have a certain number of them before certain HM moves will function in the field and before the final opponent will face them. A player who understands how to manipulate the game's systems can sometimes reach the Elite Four with a significantly reduced set of badges, demonstrating that the apparent mandatory structure of the game is less absolute than it appears. Speedrunning, in which players attempt to complete a game as quickly as possible, has generated an extensive vocabulary around the specific techniques that reduce completion, time, and the specific versions of the game that allow those techniques to function. Different versions of the same game sometimes produce meaningfully different possible completion times because of how minor variations in code affect what is possible. The community that documents and categorizes these differences has produced a body of knowledge about the Pokemon games that illuminates aspects of their construction that normal play never reveals. What both of these practices share is an approach to games as systems to be understood rather than experiences to be had, a mode of engagement that is genuinely different from the mode most players use, but that produces equally genuine forms of knowledge about the things being played. There are versions of the Pokemon games that were released in Japan and then modified before release in other regions, with modifications that reflected different assumptions about what audiences in different places would find appropriate or comprehensible. The changes between the Japanese and international versions of various Pokemon games form a body of documentation that the localization community has assembled over many years, cataloging alterations that range from straightforward translation decisions to meaningful changes in how particular content is framed or presented. Some of these changes involve the softening of elements that were deemed too intense for the intended audience outside Japan. Others involve the addition of elements to clarify narrative content that was assumed to be culturally obvious in the original context, but less so in others. A few involve the removal of content that would have caused specific problems in specific markets, whether for regulatory reasons, cultural sensitivity, or other considerations. The existence of these differences makes the Pokemon games a more interesting object of study than any single version of them suggests. The Japanese originals and their international adaptations are genuinely different texts in ways that go beyond simple translation, and the differences between them reflect a set of decisions about what different audiences need from the same story that is worth examining as its own kind of cultural document. The Pokemon series has now existed for several decades, long enough to have accumulated not just a body of games, but a body of history, a record of decisions made and paths taken and things that happened in the world alongside the games and changed how they were received. The earliest players are adults with their own children who are now experiencing the same games for the first time. The community that has existed around the games for all of that time has developed traditions that are older than many of the people now participating in them. What the iceberg represents, with its layering of surface knowledge and deeper still, is really the shape of any sufficiently large and sufficiently loved thing. Everything carries more than it shows at first. Every world that matters to people accumulates meaning at its edges, in the spaces between what is said and what is left open, in the things that players notice and name and pass to each other across the decades. The knowledge that lives in the lower layers of any iceberg is not more important than the knowledge at the surface. It is just older, or stranger, or less widely shared, or more dependent on a particular kind of attention to notice. The person who knows about the Spanish numbers and the legendary birds' names is not experiencing Pokemon more correctly than the person who simply loves Pikachu. Both are participating in the same world, just from different positions within it. There are Pokemon whose origins in the real world are clearly traceable and whose design represents something genuinely thoughtful about the animal or concept being drawn from. Horsey and Sadra draw from seahorses in ways that preserve real behavior of those animals, specifically the fact that in real seahorses, it is the male who carries thee. Developing offspring. The lore built around the Horsey line in various Pokedex entries touches on this quality without making it an explicit focus, simply including it as part of the creatures. Natural character. Goldeen draws from the ornamental goldfish of Japanese water garden tradition, stylized into something slightly more dramatic with its horn and flowing fins, but recognizable in its origin. Magikarp draws from the Japanese legend of the carp who climbs the waterfall to become a dragon, and its evolution into Gyarados is the direct expression of that story, translated into the Pokemon world's mechanics in a way so literal and so satisfying that the design became one of the most beloved narrative transformations in the series. The legend behind Magikarp and Gyarados is one of the older stories embedded in the Pokemon series, and it carries with it a set of ideas about perseverance and potential that the game does not need to state explicitly, because the transition between forms states it implicitly. A creature so weak that in the original games it can learn almost nothing useful across its entire period of development suddenly becomes one of the most powerful things in the world. The patience required to raise a Magikarp to the level at which it evolves has made the moment of transformation meaningful in a way that the games could not have engineered. Through story alone, it had to be earned. The Pokemon world contains body horror in a form that is so normalized within the context of the series that it passes largely without comment. Parasect is described as a creature whose original host organism has been entirely overridden by the parasitic mushroom growing from its back. The eyes of Parasect are described as blank, drained of the vitality that could be observed in earlier stages. The creature in its final form is no longer the original creature at all in any meaningful sense. The Paras who carried the mushroom has been replaced by the mushroom, which uses the Paras's body as a vehicle for its own purposes. This is an accurate description of the behavior of certain real fungi that parasitize insects, and the Pokemon design draws on real biological horror of considerable intensity, while presenting it through the cheerful visual vocabulary of the series. Gengar has an entry that describes it as the shadow of Clefable, a theory about the creature's origin that has circulated in the community for a long time, and that was at some point given semi-official acknowledgement in certain materials. The idea is that Gengar and Clefable are related in a way that involves transformation, that one is what the other became under specific conditions, that Shadow is related to substance in a way the games have never fully explained. The two Pokemon share a similar silhouette, a fact that is either evidence for a relationship or a coincidence of design that became the basis for a theory, and the ambiguity between those two interpretations is part of what has kept the discussion going. There are entries in the Pokemon universe where the creature described is genuinely dangerous to humans in ways that the gameplay would never suggest. Hydreigon's entries describe a creature with 3 heads, each of which bites and tears indiscriminately. The creature is described as attacking anything within its field of vision without distinction, not because it is provoked, but because that is simply its nature. The entries describe devastated areas as evidence of Hydreigon's passage, places where the creature has moved through and left destruction behind. And yet Hydreigon can be caught and trained and used in competition, where it performs reliably as a powerful dark and dragon type attacker. The disconnect between the creature as the Pokedex describes it and the creature as the player experiences it is a feature of the series rather than an oversight. The Pokedex represents a document within the world, something produced by observation and categorization that captures real information about real creatures. But the relationship between a trainer and a trained Pokemon transforms the creature's behavior in ways that the Pokedex, which describes wild specimens, does not account for. The same creature who destroys whatever it encounters in the wild has, in training, redirected that energy toward competition and away from indiscriminate destruction. This is the Pokemon world's answer to the question that its most dangerous descriptions raise. The training relationship is not just a mechanical framework for the game. Within the world's own logic, it is what makes it possible for creatures of genuine power and genuine danger to coexist with humans in the way the games describe. The Pokemon games have built their world with a consistent attention to certain symbolic registers that appear across multiple games and multiple regions. The Elemental Three, a set of 3 Pokemon representing fire, water, and grass, appears in the starter selection of every main series game. This is the most visible of these recurring structures, but others exist throughout the games that reward attention. The trio of Lake Guardians in Diamond and Pearl, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, represents knowledge, emotion, and willpower, 3 qualities that together constitute the full life of the mind as the games understand it. The creation trio of Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina represents time, space, and the antimatter that exists in opposition to the ordinary universe. These trios carry mythological weight because the structure of 3 recurs across so many traditions of meaning-making, so many ways of dividing the world into its fundamental components. The Pokemon games did not invent the use of tripartite structures, but they apply them with a consistency that suggests deliberate engagement with the tradition and awareness that grouping meaningful things in 3s gives them a particular kind of resonance. The Sword and Shield legendary pair, Zacian and Zamazenta, draws on a different tradition, the paired sacred objects of heroic legend. The sword and the shield is complementary, instruments of a single purpose. Their design in the games connects them to specific visual traditions in British and Celtic mythology, emphasizing the regional character of the Galar setting by grounding its most powerful creatures in the legendary heritage of the landscape they inhabit. The fan community around Pokemon has developed theories about the games that are so consistently discussed that they have become part of the common knowledge of serious players. Theories that exist in a space between creative interpretation and genuine inquiry. The Lavender Town tone theory, sometimes called the Lavender Town syndrome in its more dramatic iterations, claims that the original music for Lavender Town in the Japanese version of Pokémon Red and Green was composed with specific frequencies that caused physical distress in child listeners, and that this led to incidents that were covered up by Nintendo and the Japanese government. This theory is false. No such incidents occurred, and the original Japanese music, while different from the international version, does not contain frequencies with the properties the theory claims. But the theory persists because it was built around a real foundation. The original Japanese Lavender Town music is genuinely different from the version most players encountered, and the difference is audible. The international version was altered, though the reason was almost certainly the simpler one of adapting the audio for different hardware rather than removing harmful content. The gap between what players could hear and what they were told was simply the ordinary process of localization became, in the theory's telling, the cover-up of a genuine crisis. The theory is false, but it explains a real thing, the eerie quality of the music and the fact that it was changed in a way that makes a particular kind of emotional sense. There are Pokemon whose stories are told most powerfully not through their own Pokedex entries, but through the implications of the entries for other creatures. Aegislash is described as a sword that has played a role in the guidance of kings that chose worthy rulers by evaluating and accepting them. Its entry describes a creature whose existence is woven into the political history of the world it inhabits, something that was present at moments of succession and power across generations of human civilization within the Pokemon world. The sword existed before the king and will exist after the king, and the relationship between them is not simply tool and user, but something more like recognition, the creature, identifying something in a person and choosing to associate with it. This kind of lore, in which a Pokemon is described not just in terms of its own properties, but in terms of its role in human history, creates a different texture of world than the ecological lore that describes most creatures. A creature woven into the politics of human civilization is describing a relationship between the human and Pokemon worlds that is much older and much more intimate than the trainer system suggests, a relationship that predates the game's present by an indefinite stretch of history. Haxorus has a simpler entry that illuminates the world through a different kind of detail. Its axes are described as harder than most metals and capable of cutting through steel beams. The entry mentions that the axes can be sharpened after they are damaged by grinding them against rocks, an almost mundane piece of maintenance behavior that makes the creature feel more real by giving it an ordinary relationship to its own equipment. The extraordinary thing has an ordinary maintenance routine, and that combination creates something worth sitting with. The Pokemon games have engaged with the concept of time travel and timeline divergence more explicitly in recent years, but the seed of this concept exists in the earliest games in ways that are easy to overlook. The player character in Pokémon Gold and Silver can travel back to the original Kanto region after completing the Johto storyline, encountering a version of the world that is set 3 years after the events of Red and Blue. This makes Gold and Silver the only main series games to directly show the passage of time within the world, to present a Kanto that is recognizably the same and yet visibly different, a place that has continued to exist in the interval between games. The details of what has changed and what has remained the same in that 3-year gap are part of what makes the return to Kanto in Gold and Silver such an affecting experience. For players who remembered the original games, the gym leaders have different dialogue. The world has moved on in small ways. In the final encounter with Red, the player character from the original games presents the avatar of the first journey as an opponent who has continued to grow in the years. Since that journey ended, who has become something extraordinary and who waits in silence at the peak of a mountain for a worthy challenger. Red's silence in that encounter, the fact that he does not speak even in the moment of battle, has been interpreted in many ways by the community. Some readings emphasize the symbolism of meeting one's former self. Others read the silence as a statement about the nature of the character who never had dialogue to lose. Whatever the intended meaning, the encounter remains one of the most discussed moments in the series, a meeting at the intersection of two games and two eras and two interpretations of what being a Pokemon trainer ultimately means. There are games in the Pokemon series that were designed primarily for younger audiences, but that contain narrative decisions more emotionally complex than their presentation suggests. Pokemon Ranger places the player in the role of a ranger rather than a trainer, someone whose relationship with Pokemon is built around temporary assistance and release rather than permanent capture and training. The ranger's approach to Pokemon is in some ways more ethically comfortable within the world's own terms, built around helping rather than owning, around forming connections that do not require the creature to be permanently confined. The games explore what it means to help rather than to collect, to have relationships with creatures that are meaningful precisely because they are not permanent. This is a different emotional register than the main series uses, and it creates a different kind of attachment between player and creature, one that mirrors the kind of loss and continuation that some real relationships involve. The Pokemon Ranger games were commercially successful, but have not received entries in many years, and the specific emotional territory they explored has not been revisited in quite the same form by subsequent spin-offs. The territory they occupied, the space between human convenience and Pokemon autonomy, is one that the main series continues to avoid addressing directly, though the questions the Ranger games raised continue to exist at the edge of the world the main games describe. The concept of Mega Evolution, introduced in Pokemon X and Y, changed the visual language of the series in ways that revealed something about how much the design team was willing to experiment with established creatures. Mega Evolution produced alternate forms of Pokemon that already existed, transformations triggered in battle by specific held items that created dramatically different visual identities from the base forms. Some Mega Evolutions maintain the basic character of their standard forms while amplifying specific qualities. Others produced something that looked quite different, that emphasized aspects of the creature's design that the standard form had subordinated or suggested rather than stated directly. Mega Charizard X, the version of Mega Charizard that is exclusive to Pokemon X, gave the fire-typed Charizard a dragon typing that players had long felt the creature should have, had given its obvious visual relationship to dragons throughout the series. The change generated significant discussion, partly because it addressed a long-standing community position about the creature's classification, and partly because the design itself departed visibly from the base form's color palette, replacing orange with black and giving the fire a blue quality that felt visually significant. The decision to eventually discontinue Mega Evolution as an active mechanic in later games, while retaining the forms as documented parts of the world's history, reflects the series' ongoing challenge of how to add features that feel meaningful without committing to them permanently. Systems that players invest in and then lose access to create a specific kind of frustration, and the way the series has handled the deprecation of Mega Evolution and the Z move. System that followed it reflects an ongoing negotiation between mechanical novelty and player attachment. The Pokemon trading card game exists in a separate but related world from the video games, one where the creatures appear in different contexts with different artwork and different mechanical interpretations, and where the culture of collection operates according to its own particular logic. The artwork on individual cards has always been one of the most discussed aspects of the physical card game, with certain illustrations becoming particularly celebrated within the community for the way they interpret familiar creatures through specific visual approaches. Some of the most beloved card illustrations present Pokemon in contexts that the games never show, in domestic settings, and moments of play or rest, in environments that suggest a life outside battle and training. The cards Slowpoke and Psyduck, which appeared in the fossil expansion of the original card game, presents the two creatures sitting together on a log beside a small pool in an image that captures something about the texture of the Pokemon world that the game itself rarely shows directly. The creatures are simply existing, not in the context of battle or capture, just present in a landscape that seems to have room for them. This quality of Pokemon as beings who have their own existence apart from their relationship with trainers is something the card artwork has explored more freely than the games. The most valuable cards in the trading card game are sometimes valuable primarily for reasons related to rarity mechanics rather than artistic merit or gameplay utility, which creates a separation between what is most aesthetically interesting and what is most economically significant. These two categories occasionally align, with cards that are both rare and beautifully illustrated becoming particularly sought after, but the alignment is not guaranteed. There is a particular quality to the Pokemon games of the second generation that sets them apart in the memory of many players who experienced them, a quality related to the specific ambition of what those games tried to accomplish. Gold and Silver were designed with the goal of containing two complete regions, Johto and Kanto, within a single cartridge. This was a substantial technical challenge for the hardware they were built on, and the solution required significant compression and optimization of every element of both regions data. The result was a game that felt genuinely expansive, that seemed to offer more than should have been possible given the constraints of its medium, that kept revealing new things after players believed they had seen everything. The postgame in Gold and Silver, in which the player travels to Kanto and works through its gyms after completing the main Johto story, was a feature that players of the original games had not expected, and that created the specific kind of surprise that is very difficult to engineer deliberately. It required the player to have finished the game in the conventional sense, and then discover that the game continued, that there was more, that what had seemed like the ending was actually the midpoint of a larger structure. The Pokemon series has attempted to replicate the surprise of Gold and Silver's postgame in various subsequent titles, with varying success. The challenge is that the success of that surprise depended on players not knowing it existed, and once that precedent was established, every subsequent game entered a community that was actively looking for similar moments. The element of unexpectedness cannot be preserved indefinitely once it has become an expectation. The sound design of the Pokemon games has contributed more to the experience of the world than is always recognized, creating sonic environments that players associate with specific locations and specific emotional states in ways that are difficult to separate from the visual elements of those spaces. The music for Pokémon Gold and Silver is widely regarded as among the strongest in the series, composed by Junichi Masuda in a way that made each route and each city feel distinct. The route between Violet City and Azalea Town carries a quality of morning light in its composition, something about its tempo and its instrumental choices that suggests the early part of a journey. The music of the ice path is slower and more isolated, a sound that matches the environment of the cave in a way that makes the cold feel real despite the hardware's limitations. The music for Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, composed on more capable hardware, pursued a different aesthetic, more orchestral in its ambitions, and more varied in its tonal range. The town of Hearthome City has music that sits in a register different from any previous Pokémon town, something about it that feels like an early autumn afternoon, a quality that players have associated with that specific location across years of memory. The connection between the music of the games and the memories players have formed around them is one of the most powerful threads in the community's relationship to the series. Music encodes experience in ways that are not fully understood, creating pathways back to specific moments that visual memory alone does not provide. The Pokémon games have provided that kind of music consistently, and the community's response to remixed or reimagined versions of familiar themes reflects how deeply the original compositions have embedded themselves. There are Pokémon whose designs engage with specific scientific concepts in ways that reward attention from anyone familiar with the field being referenced. Magnezone and its pre-evolutions draw from the physics of magnetic fields, with the creature's designs literally incorporating the visual representation of magnetic polarity. The three screws visible on Magnezone correspond to the way electromagnetic configurations sometimes appear in physics illustrations, and the creature's movement patterns in the anime and in various promotional materials reflect the way magnetic fields interact with each other, with magnemite clusters sometimes depicted as either attracting or repelling each other based on their polarity orientation. Electrode is one of the simplest Pokémon designs in terms of visual complexity, a sphere divided into a red upper portion and a white lower portion with a face. The design is sometimes read as an inversion of the Pokeball design, red and white reversed, suggesting a creature that has, in some sense, become the object meant to contain it. The entries for Electrode describe a creature that accumulates electrical energy and releases it explosively, and that is described as difficult to control and prone to detonation for reasons that are sometimes presented as temperamental rather than purely physical. The image of a creature that has become its own container that holds energy until the pressure is too great carries a meaning that the simple design somehow communicates, despite the minimal visual information it provides. The concept of legendary Pokémon has evolved considerably across the history of the series, from the relatively limited set of special encounters in the original games to the elaborate mythologies that surround the legendaries of later generations. In the original games, the legendary birds and Mewtwo existed primarily as powerful encounters available at specific locations, without extensive backstory or mythological weight. Their significance came primarily from their statistical power and their rarity, from the fact that there was only one of each in any playthrough. The connection between legendary status and narrative significance was present, but limited. By the time of the third generation, the legendary Pokémon had begun to carry the weight of the world's mythology explicitly. Rayquaza, Kyogre and Groudon were not simply rare, powerful creatures, but entities whose existence and conflict was woven into the origin of the world itself. The legendaries had become the means by which the games narrated the Pokemon world's cosmology, vehicles for a kind of myth-making that the series had not initially built itself to do. The 6th generation introduced legendary Pokemon whose lore explicitly addressed themes of life and death, of the balance between creation and destruction, of what it means for something to exist within a universe that is indifferent to individual existence. Xerneas, who represents life and renewal, and Yveltal, who represents death and absorption, carry a weight that connects to the oldest themes in human mythological tradition. The awareness that life and death are not opposites, but partners, that the same force that generates existence also eventually reclaims it. There is a set of Pokemon whose designs seem at first to be purely playful or decorative, but that contain specific scientific or cultural references that become visible once pointed toward. Vanillite, Vanillish, and Vanillux are ice cream cone Pokemon whose designs generated significant criticism at the time of their introduction, with many players arguing that they represented a failure of imagination, a resort to simply rendering everyday objects as Pokemon without any deeper thought. But the design of these creatures incorporates accurate visual reference to the crystalline structure of ice, with the snow on Vanillite's head shaped to suggest the hexagonal lattice arrangement of ice crystals at the microscopic level. The design is doing something more specific than simply depicting ice cream, though the surface read is exactly that. Klefki, a Pokemon that takes the form of a keyring with collected keys, draws on the folk belief in various European traditions that certain spirits collect and hoard small metal objects, particularly keys. The connection between keys and access, between the held object and the places it opens, gives the creature a layer of meaning that is easy to miss, but that makes the design more interesting once noticed. Garbodor, a creature whose design is built around a garbage bag, exists within the tradition of Pokemon designs that take something humans generally want to avoid thinking about and make it the primary subject. The creature's entries describe it as having arisen in areas of accumulated refuse, as a creature that has been shaped by the waste of human civilization in the same way that a creature in a forest is shaped by the trees. The design makes a point about what we discard and what grows in the spaces we don't pay attention to. There are moments in the community's history around Pokemon that were generated by very specific interactions between the game's mechanics and player behavior, moments that became known widely enough to become reference points in community discussion. The Pokemon known as Shedinja has a unique ability called Wonder Guard that prevents any damage from moves that are not super effective against the Pokemon's type combination. Since Shedinja is a ghost and bug type, the number of move types that can damage it at all is limited. This made Shedinja a creature of significant interest in certain competitive contexts, particularly at levels of play where the available move pool was restricted enough to make a creature that cannot be hit by most things genuinely threatening. The specific way Shedinja is obtained, by evolving a Nincada while having an open slot in the party and a Pokeball available, creates a situation where the game generates a Pokemon without the player explicitly requesting one, as if the empty shell of the evolution produced a second creature spontaneously. This mechanic, and the folklore around it in Pokedex entries, describing the creature as a being that should not be looked at because it steals the soul of anyone who peers. Through its wing, created a specific emotional texture around an objectively odd mechanical quirk. The community's relationship to Shedinja reflects something about how the most interesting parts of the Pokemon games are often the corners, the mechanical interactions that were not quite anticipated, the creatures whose existence the system generates rather than the player requests, the places where the ordinary logic of the world bends slightly, and something unexpected appears. The Pokemon games have always existed in conversation with the world of competitive gaming more broadly, and the ways in which Pokemon has been positioned relative to other competitive games reveal something about what the franchise understands itself to be. The official competitive circuit for Pokemon, the World Championships that occur annually, draws players from around the world who have spent considerable time developing the specific skills required to compete at the highest level. The combination of strategic team building, which requires knowledge of the statistical interactions between hundreds of creatures, and in-game decision-making, which requires reading opponent behavior and managing uncertainty in real time, creates a skill set that is specific to Pokemon and that requires significant investment to develop. The top players in Pokemon competition are often young, reflecting the way the game's community was structured at the time that competitive play became organized. Many of the players who competed at the highest levels in the early years of official competition have now transitioned into roles as content creators, commentators, or coaches, and the knowledge they developed carries differently in those contexts than it did in active competition. The experience of watching high-level Pokemon competition is different for players who understand the statistical and strategic elements of what they are watching compared to those who do not, and the growth of commentary and analysis content around competitive play has served as a kind of translation layer between those two experiences. The game that looks like a turn-based children's game to a casual observer is doing something considerably more complex at the highest levels of play, and making that complexity visible to interested audiences has been one of the ongoing projects of the competitive community. There are Pokemon whose competitive histories span multiple generations and whose position in the community's imagination has shifted significantly as the games have changed around them. Wobbuffet is one of these. In the early years of competitive play, Wobbuffet's ability Shadow Tag, which prevented opponents from switching Pokemon out of battle, combined with its specific counterattack. Mechanics created situations in battle that many players found frustrating. The creature was restricted or banned in various competitive formats because of how effectively it removed the option to change strategy, trapping opponents into confrontations they might have been able to avoid. A Pokemon who limits your choices creates a different kind of pressure than a Pokemon who simply deals damage. The community's relationship to Wobbuffet reflects something about how competitive restrictions work, how the same mechanical element can be celebrated as clever play in one context and resented as unfun in another. The definition of what constitutes legitimate strategy versus what constitutes exploiting a loophole that the game should not have provided is never fixed and different. Communities have drawn that line differently. Wobbuffet sits on that line in a way that has made it a recurring reference point in discussions about the philosophy of competitive rules. Its anime counterpart, the Wobbuffet belonging to Jessie of Team Rocket, became one of the most recognizable non-main character Pokemon in the series, providing physical comedy. Through repeated appearances that treated the creature's habit of saluting at unexpected moments as a consistent personality trait. The anime Woobuffet and the competitive Woobuffet are barely recognizable as the same creature, which illustrates how differently the games and the animated series have always approached the same material. There is a category of Pokemon design that is sometimes called convergent, where creatures from different evolutionary lines arrive at superficially similar forms because they occupy similar ecological niches within the Pokemon world. This concept, which mirrors the real biological phenomenon of convergent evolution, where unrelated animals develop similar features because of similar environmental pressures, appears across multiple generations of the series. The Alolan Diglett and Alolan Dugtrio, adaptations of Kanto Pokemon to the island environment of Alola, differ from their originals in ways that the lore attributes to the different pressures of island life. The Galarian variants introduced in Sword and Shield created an entire system around this concept, presenting familiar Pokemon transformed by the specific conditions of a region, loosely modeled on Great Britain, into forms that carry different typings, different aesthetics, and different entries in the Pokedex. Galarian Darumaka and Darmanitan became ice types rather than fire types, because the region they inhabit is cold enough that the original fire adaptation became a liability rather than an advantage. The logic within the world is internally consistent, presenting evolution as a response to environmental pressure that happens across generations rather than within individual lifespans, which is much closer to actual evolutionary biology than the within lifetime transformation that the main evolution mechanic describes. The regional variant concept opened the series to a kind of retrospective world building, the ability to describe how the same creature might have developed differently in a different environment that gave the games a new way to add complexity to the world without simply adding new creatures to it. The Pokemon series has always had a complex relationship with nostalgia, producing games that acknowledge the history of the series while trying to remain accessible to players who are encountering it for the first time. The remakes that have punctuated the series, Fireword and Leaf Green for the original Kanto games, Heart Gold and Soul Silver for Gold and Silver, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire for Ruby and Sapphire exist in a space between recreation and reimagining. They preserve the essential structure and narrative of their originals while adding features, graphics, and quality of life improvements developed in the years since those originals were made. The result is something that is neither quite the original game nor quite a new one, a layered object that players who remember the original experience differently than players who encounter it for the first time. The quality of those remakes has varied in the community's assessment, with the Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes particularly celebrated for the care they brought to the original Gold and Silver experience, adding features like the walking Pokemon mechanic that many players now regard as among the series' best and most missed elements. The Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire remakes similarly added narrative depth to the Hoenn mythology through the Delta episode, creating new legendary encounters and new story. Content that engaged with the cosmological themes of the originals at greater length. The way players relate to remakes reflects something broader about how games and memory interact. Playing a game you loved as a child in a new form involves a negotiation between the memory of the original and the experience of the present, a comparison that is sometimes flattering to both and sometimes reveals how much the original existed partly in the circumstances of first encounter rather than purely in its own qualities. The various Pokemon that draw from mythology across different cultural traditions create a map of what the series designers found significant, a record of which stories and which beings from human history were compelling enough to be translated into the Pokemon world's visual language. The Raikou, Entei, and Suicune trio from Gold and Silver each draw from a different tradition of mythological beast. Raikou is described in some detail as relating to the Raiju, a creature from Japanese mythology said to ride on lightning and take various animal forms. Entei carries associations with the lion as a regal and powerful symbol that crosses multiple cultural traditions. Suicune draws specifically from the north wind and from the concept of purification, specifically through water, that appears in various East Asian ceremonial contexts. The Ho-Oh, whose legend connects to the burning of the Ecrotech Tower and the transformation of 3 ordinary Pokemon into the legendary beasts, is itself a creature built from the mythology of the Feng Wong, the Chinese phoenix, a bird associated with virtue, good fortune, and the transition between eras. The way Ho-Oh's fire creates, rather than destroys, bringing the legendary beasts into existence from the creatures killed in the tower's burning, inverts the ordinary association between fire and loss in a way that the game handles with more grace than the surface of its storytelling might suggest. These creatures carry their mythological origins lightly, embedded in their appearance and in the lore surrounding them without requiring any knowledge of the source material too. Appreciate what the Pokemon are doing within their own world, but for players who do bring that knowledge, the layer of resonance it adds is real and worth having. There is a particular quality to the way the Pokemon games have always handled the moment of the very first starter Pokemon choice that sets the tone for everything that follows. The choice is presented as consequential, which it is. The starter Pokemon travels with the player through the entire game, appearing in every major story encounter, growing alongside the player's own development as a trainer. Players often develop strong attachments to their starters in ways they do not always develop with Pokemon caught later in the game, because the starter was there from the beginning, was present during the learning phase, was part of the experience of discovering what the game was. The cultural context around starter Pokemon choices has become one of the defining community debates of the series, with each generation's trio generating extended discussion about which is the best choice and why. These conversations are never purely about strategic utility, though they sometimes include that element. They are about identity and preference and the specific qualities that different players value, played out through the symbolic choice of a starting creature. The phenomenon of starter trading, the community behavior where players trade their chosen starters to allow other players access to all 3 within a single playthrough, reflects how the exclusivity of the starter choice can feel limiting once a player has played through the game enough times. The original scarcity that made the choice meaningful gets circumvented through cooperation, and the community developed norms around this kind of exchange that are specific to the Pokemon context but connect to broader patterns in how communities manage scarcity and access. The quietest layer of the Pokemon Iceberg is not the darkest or the strangest, but the one that is easiest to pass through without noticing. It is the layer of small decisions and small details that accumulated across decades of design and development, choices that no single player would be likely to notice, but that, in aggregate, create the specific texture of a world that feels genuinely inhabited, the positioning of trees in the original games that prevents certain shortcuts, the specific cry that Marowak makes that is different from the cries of other Pokemon in a way that is difficult to articulate but immediately recognizable. The way the music in certain locations shifts very slightly between day and night, not dramatically different, but noticeably changed. These small decisions are the ones that rarely get discussed, that do not generate community theories or extended analysis, that simply exist as part of the fabric of the world. They are the equivalent of the particular way a familiar place smells, or the quality of light in a specific room at a specific time of day, things that contribute to a feeling, without being nameable as the cause of it. The people who made these small decisions knew that most players would never consciously notice them. They made them anyway, because a world that is attended to at that level of detail feels different from a world that is not, even if no player can say exactly why or how. The care is detectable even when its specific expressions are not. That accumulated care is what the iceberg is ultimately made of, all the way down, through the Spanish numbers and the mythological references, and the competitive histories, and the folk theories, and the banned episodes, and the real ecological anxieties and the developer decisions that never quite made it to the player. What the iceberg is made of is care. The ongoing attention of people who loved what they were making enough to make it more than they were required to make it. The Pokemon games have always rewarded players who read slowly, who notice what is placed in the corners of rooms and the dialogue of minor characters who appear on a single route and are never referenced again. The man who stands near the edge of Pallet Town in the original games at the invisible boundary the game imposes before the player has received a starter Pokemon stops thee. Player with a single observation about the danger of tall grass and the wisdom of going to the professor first. He appears nowhere else in the game. He has no name. His single dialogue line is functional, steering the player in the correct direction. But there is something in the placement of him, the care taken to ensure that even the very first moment of restriction in the game had a reason attached to it that reflects the design philosophy of the whole series in miniature. The world of Pokemon is full of such presences, characters who occupy a single bench, who observe a single sky, who say a single thing about the quality of the route they have been watching all day. They exist to make the world feel inhabited rather than empty, to suggest that the story the player is passing through is not the only story happening, that other things continue. At the edges of the main narrative, in ways that the game cannot fully show, but that it wants to gesture toward. The fishing guru who appears in the original games, the man who gives the player a fishing rod and asks only that they remember to try fishing in different places, carries within his dialogue the suggestion of a life spent beside water, a person whose relationship to the world has been organized around patience and the belief that what you are looking for is in the next spot a little further along the shore. There are creatures in the Pokemon world whose designs engage with the concept of death more directly than the games typically acknowledge, and whose existence raises questions about the afterlife that the world implies but does not fully describe. Yamask is described as a creature that carries a mask resembling its own face from when it was a human. The entries state that Yamask sometimes stares at the mask and cries. This is one of the more emotionally direct pieces of Pokemon lore, acknowledging not just that death exists in the Pokemon world, but that the experience of having been human and becoming something else is a source of ongoing grief. The creature cannot forget what it was, and that inability to forget is presented not as a neutral feature of its existence, but as something genuinely sad. Cofagrigus, the evolution of Yamask, is described as having entirely lost the memories of its human life. The evolution is in this sense a kind of second death, the loss of what remained after the first. Whether this is a mercy or an additional loss is not stated in the entries. The game leaves that question open in the way it leaves most of its deeper questions open, presenting the situation without resolving how to feel about it. Phantump, a creature described as the spirit of a child who died in a forest and came to inhabit a tree stump, carries the same quality of quiet sadness without requiring the player to dwell on it. The design is charming enough that children can enjoy it without engaging with the backstory, while the entries provide a layer of context for players who want more than the Surface presents. This double register, working simultaneously as charming and as genuinely sorrowful, is one of the things the Pokémon series does that more deliberately dark properties often cannot manage. The history of the Pokémon anime extends beyond the main series into a set of films that each engaged with different aspects of the world's mythology, and some of those films took the mythology further than the games from which they drew. Pokémon the Movie 2000 built its story around the three legendary birds of Kanto, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, and a fourth legendary, Lugia, described as the guardian of the sea whose song could calm any storm. The film presented Lugia as a creature who had withdrawn from the world because its power was too great to be expressed without causing harm, a being who chose isolation as an act of protection rather than indifference. This characterization of power made responsible through restraint was more explicitly philosophical than most of the game lore surrounding these creatures. The theme of the film, that the water of the sea and the fire of Moltres and the ice of Articuno and the lightning of Zapdos are all expressions of a single underlying balance that Lugia maintains, gave the legendary birds a narrative coherence they did not fully have in the games. They became parts of a system rather than simply rare encounters, connected to each other and to a guardian whose existence was defined by the relationships among them. The prophecy that structures the film, delivered through a character who speaks in rhyme about the Chosen One and the balance of nature, is another example of the Pokémon world. Using mythological conventions to give its legendary content weight, prophecy implies a world in which certain things are already decided, in which individual actions carry cosmic significance, and the film places its child protagonist in that framework without quite acknowledging the pressure it represents. There are moments in long careers that define how everything surrounding them is understood, and for the Pokémon series there are several such moments whose influence extended far beyond the immediate context in which they occurred. The release of Pokémon Go in the summer of 2016 was one of these moments, an event that took the augmented reality format and the Pokémon license and produced something that brought the franchise to an audience that had not previously engaged with it, while simultaneously reactivating the memories and affections of players who had grown up with the original games. The images of people standing in parks at midnight, phones raised, hunting creatures that appeared in overlay on the physical world, became one of the defining images of that summer. The game's use of real geography, turning parks and landmarks and local businesses into gyms and Pokestops, created a relationship between the game world and the physical world that was different from anything the franchise had previously attempted. Players discovered places in their own neighborhoods that they had not previously visited because the game placed a collectible within them. The game's mechanics around community events and raids required physical co-location with other players in ways that generated spontaneous social gatherings in public spaces. The trajectory of Pokémon Go, after its initial moment of extraordinary cultural visibility, is its own story, involving the refinement of mechanics, the addition of content, and the gradual shift from broad cultural phenomenon to dedicated player base. The community that remained with the game after the initial wave of casual players moved on developed its own vocabulary and its own culture, and that community has maintained its engagement with the game for years in ways that the people who downloaded the app in the summer of 2016 and then stopped playing generally did not predict. The process by which new Pokemon designs are developed and refined has been described in various interviews and presentations by members of the design team, and what emerges from those descriptions is a picture of systematic exploration followed by ruthless selection. The design team generates far more concepts than will ever become Pokemon. Some of those concepts are developed far enough to have detailed sketches and type assignments before being cut. Others are fully modeled and animated before a decision is made not to include them. The criteria for selection involve a combination of visual distinctiveness, thematic coherence with the region being built, competitive role within the game's ecosystem, and what might loosely be called emotional resonance, the quality of making players feel something specific and distinct. The concept of the silhouette test, which involves evaluating a Pokemon design by whether it is recognizable from its outline alone, is one of the most discussed elements of the design philosophy that the team has described publicly. A design that works in silhouette is a design that has a clear, distinctive form, one that cannot be confused with other designs even when all surface detail is removed. The most iconic Pokemon designs tend to pass this test without effort. Pikachu is recognizable in silhouette, so is Gengar and Snorlax and Charizard. The discipline required to cut designs that represent significant invested work, that were developed far enough to feel real, is one of the qualities that has maintained the series' consistency across generations. The cut designs exist as evidence of that discipline, records of ideas that were developed and judged and found insufficient, not always because they were bad ideas, but because the best work requires more ideas than can be used and the courage to discard the surplus. There is a tendency in discussions about the Pokemon series to treat different generations of the games as competitors, to position the preferences of one era against another in ways that generate heat without producing much light. The argument that any particular generation of Pokemon is the best, or that the series declined after a specific point, or that earlier designs were objectively superior to later ones, is one of the most persistent forms of discussion in the community and one of the least conclusive. Players who grew up with specific generations of the games carry those experiences in ways that are genuinely different from players who encountered the series later or earlier. And those experiences shape aesthetic judgments in ways that are real, but that are also not universal. The designs of the original 151 Pokemon are frequently described as simpler and more coherent than those of later generations, but this description reflects both the actual aesthetic choices of that era and the familiarity of players who have lived with those designs for decades. The Pokemon of the original games are familiar in the way that a language learned in childhood is familiar, available without effort, recognizable without analysis. Later designs require more effort because they are less familiar, and the effort required can be mistaken for a quality of the designs themselves. The series has maintained a consistent approach to design across its history, while also changing in ways that reflect new hardware, new cultural contexts, and new creative directions. Both of those things are true at once. The series is consistent and the series has changed, and both the consistency and the change are features of a creative enterprise that has operated for decades with genuine care for what it was producing. There are sounds in the Pokémon games that exist at the very edge of what the hardware could produce, and the memory of those sounds is inseparable from the memory of the games themselves. The cry of Mewtwo in the original games, synthesized from the Game Boy's limited sound chip, carries a quality of alien authority that the hardware should not have been capable of. The specific frequency of it, the way it rises and then falls in a pattern that does not quite match any biological sound, created an impression of something genuinely other, something that the visual sprite of the creature on its own could not fully establish. The town fanfare that plays when the player heals at a Pokémon Center has been consistent across versions of the games, one of the most stable pieces of audio in a series that has otherwise changed its music significantly across hardware generations. The familiarity of that specific sequence of tones is one of the things that ties different generations of players together, a shared audio memory that connects the experience of playing in 1999 to the experience of playing today. These sounds are the connective tissue of the Pokémon world, the elements that travel through memory in a different way than visual elements do, that return not just as recollections, but as physical sensations, the particular quality of attention that settles when a familiar piece of music begins. The Pokémon series has been making sounds for long enough that those sounds have become part of the personal histories of a significant number of people embedded in their experience of growing up in a way that nothing made by a design team in an office building intended to become embedded can fully account for. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.